Yeah, so what we want to talk about now, we've already covered in the first session kind of an intro to SmartResponse, leveraging out-of-the-box content, really where to get started. The second session that we want to go through is all about building SmartResponse content. So this is going to get a little bit more technical, and we've got a really cool use case to go through that any of you guys on 7.3 or above?
7.4, I believe, is where the host API was introduced.
I think I might
We'll double check
my
on that.
microphone. Am I on? Can't even tell. All right, how's that? Still no. All right.
You're on now.
I have no idea. All right.
It's glowing.
Cool. So I want to go through an example that leverages some of the built-in logarithm APIs, just as an example of how you might build a SmartResponse plugin to do some of the kind of internal administration actions. So the use case that we want to go through is getting a host's risk level back out of the host and entity management API. And that's got a handful of steps that we're going to work through. So really the first thing is looking at the API itself. We want to understand what data we have to work with and what data we need to get back from this API. Then we'll do something like mock this up in PowerShell, maybe through pseudocode, maybe just writing out comments, and then filling in the PowerShell to say, now I have a script that I can execute in the the PowerShell ISE or in VS Code or something like that that will actually bring back the data that I'm interested in. The third step is going to be building out this actions.xml. And we'll get into a little more detail on that, but essentially what we're talking about here is a configuration file, an XML configuration file, that all it does is map the fields that you see in SmartResponse to the parameters of the script that you've just written. That's really all we're doing, is rearranging data so that you've got a one-liner in PowerShell that's being executed. And then finally, we've got some housekeeping stuff that you have to do through the client console in order to actually build a SmartResponse plugin and have something that you can import. All right, so...
I think, can you go back one slide?
Yeah, sure.
The core thing here is we are trying to get to that output where it says this host has a risk level of high medium. So you'll kind of see that throughout the presentation. Yeah,
we've got one particular use case that we're going to keep referring back to here. So the host API is really where we need to start. And if I were doing this in my own deployment, I would probably do something like create a test host that I can assign a specific risk level to so that I know what data I need to be able to get back. The other thing that we do is we provide documentation around all of our APIs. It's all live documentation through a tool called Redoc. So anywhere you've got an API available, you can hit the local host, actually on any system that's running the logarithm API gateway, which is a service that you'll see installed in Windows or on the DX. And if you go to the right endpoint, actually if you just go to 8505, you'll see all the APIs listed. Pick one out of that list and add /docs, and you'll get the live documentation that tells you every parameter you need to pass into that request and all the data that you're going to get back out of it. And then actually working with that in Postman. So using a tool like Postman, there's a handful of other like REST API tools out there that just help you build out, keep lists of parameters, store tokens in memory that you can, call a login endpoint and then pass that token back. So starting to work with the actual API itself, this is what Redoc actually looks like. So in this case, we're looking at that hosts endpoint. You can see the upper right-hand corner, get/hosts. So what we're getting back is just, well, you can see the example right in there, where we're going to pull back host information from that API rather than visualize through the console. We're just dumping it out as a JSON object, and I think it should be visible in there.
The sixth one down, risk level.
Yep. Yeah.
So laser pointer on there as well.
I do. So you can see risk level in here for this host ID 0 is currently set to none. Right, so that's the host that we're looking at currently. So moving on from there, once we start building an API query to hit that host endpoint, we can look at the documentation and it'll say the parameter that we need to pass is name. So I've added this question mark to say now I'm going to pass this this parameter name and the name of that test host to the API.
So if you're not familiar with Postman, Sam Straka, one of our technical product manager peers, has done a great community post on using Postman and on getting that API key, especially in 7.4 where we made enhancements to our API key management. So I encourage you to find that, and we'll try to get that into the resources of this deck if it's not already there.
Yeah, and actually that's a great point. One of the things that it's going to talk about is how do you authenticate to this API? You know, it's not the case that you can just call into the logarithm APIs and dump data back out. It wouldn't be very secure. So one of the things that it talks about, both in our API documentation under some of the general sections and through Sam's documentation, is how do we authenticate? And you actually do that with this authorization header field by adding bearer and a token that you can get either as a user token through the client console. You can build yourself I think it might still be called a case API token in current versions, or you can add a third-party integration. There's a new tab in some of the newer versions for a third-party integration. This is a perfect example of we're trying to build a third-party integration through SmartResponse. So once we pass that header, we're filling in the parameter with our host name that we're trying to get information back from. Now we're going to get a response that looks like this. And now you can see it's actually done the lookup for me, and it says, all right, test host 999 that we created before has ID number 4, and its risk level is right here. Right? So now we've found the host that we're interested in. We've passed that as a parameter to the API, and we're actually getting information back into Postman that we're interested in. So what does this look like in PowerShell?
So PowerShell, I don't want this to be a PowerShell tutorial. If you're not familiar with PowerShell, I'll try to walk you through it and call out some of the core things. We've also got an example in Python in the appendix. Those are probably the 2 most popular languages that we use. But as Matt said, this is just running on the command line. So anything that can run on a Windows command line, you can write a SmartResponse plugin to leverage. And what that actions.xml configuration file is doing is stringing together the command that gets run there.
Yeah, there was actually a great example in the community not too long ago that I was just chatting with somebody with. You don't actually have to call a script. Like there are cases where we've just run command line utilities or called executables. The one that we were talking about was NSLOOKUP. You know, this user had a need to just get information via NSLOOKUP, pass it a host name, get an IP address back, pass it an IP address, get a host name back. Well, you can run that from the command line, so we just wrapped it in SmartResponse so you can run it automatically.
So there's a couple steps here. We're going to go through each one. The first part is I never start from blank in PowerShell. I had some Hello World PowerShell that I put together a while back. This is included in the appendix along with the configuration file for both PowerShell and Python that do the same thing. Really all it does is it says, hey, let me pass you a string into the SmartResponse, and it prints out that string the number of times that you want to print it out. There we go, number. So I start from there. That gives me some of the structure, like the commandlet binding and the parameters. So I'm going to start with those 3 parameters that we remember from the Postman. I need an admin API URL, which I can actually give a default, because if I run this from the platform manager, it just calls into localhost LR-admin API. I need the API key that I generated from the client console, and I need the logarithm host that we're trying to get the risk level of. I'm also going to add a 4th down here that says, what action am I doing? For now, we're doing a get risk level, but maybe we want to go back later and say, set risk level, if I want to change that risk level from a SmartResponse. So now instead of spinning up a completely new SmartResponse plugin, it becomes another action within that SmartResponse plugin, and it's just a parameter from within the PowerShell script that I'm calling. So the first part of this PowerShell is what goes out to the API and gets the result. It uses the PowerShell invoke REST method, and I've actually collapsed that here. It's in the appendix if you want to go into more detail. Suffice to say, what we're getting out of this function is either empty, if that host didn't exist, or it's going to be that same JSON blob that we got out of the Postman. And so usually I just keep Postman open so I can refer back and forth. So now what we're saying here is I'm going to get the host object from the API, and my first case that I'm going to talk about is I did not find a host. So I'm just going to write host. All SmartResponse is doing is taking that standard out from the command prompt and feeding that back up into your web console or wherever else that output is going. And what's critical here is this exit code. So if you're not familiar with exit codes, you can really simplify it. Exit 1 means there was an error. And exit 0 means it was successful. So if you are using SmartResponse at all, or you go over to our demo system, at the bottom of an alarm card, if there's SmartResponse plugins attached to it, it'll say SmartResponse executed successfully, or SmartResponse failed, or SmartResponse partial failure. These exit 1 and exit 0 is how the SmartResponse infrastructure knows, did it succeed or did it fail? So if you're using those exit codes correctly, that's going to bubble the infrastructure information for you to be able to use this later on. So we're writing an error that the host wasn't found. This next part here is saying, all right, I found a host. Now I'm going to get, if I'm going to get the risk level, that action that we said earlier, and you might be adding other if statements down here, or switch statements that say if set risk level. But for now, we're saying if I'm getting the risk level, I'm just going to pull this host object .id, and just, again, flipping back to the postman, ID was 4, and risk level was high medium. And I just make a variable for each and write that out into the right host. And the important thing to call out here is if you remember the output we were going for from that initial screenshot, host, test host 999, ID 4 has risk level high medium, that's this right host statement right here. So I'm just writing it out with the information in there, and that's what I see when I run this thing in the web console. So I think that's the biggest core concept we have as part of this, is anything that I write out in PowerShell, right host, or an echo in Python, that's what I'm going to see. So before I mess with the rest of the SmartResponse infrastructure, I usually test it within PowerShell itself. I come up with a couple parameters, and I say what I'm expecting, and then I just run the .ps1 file with a couple of those input parameters. And what I get out is this first one, where I expect a success, prints out what I expect, and then I get 3 errors down here when I have a bad API key, or a host that doesn't exist, or an action that doesn't exist. So this allows me to test without the overhead of having to run the actions file, and I should get this working and my output as expected, just running it through PowerShell before I go on to the next step.
All right, so now that we've got a working script, the next piece that we need to talk about is that XML configuration. And I talked about it just a little bit earlier, but essentially all we're doing here is wrapping, or is mapping the input parameters that we're feeding into SmartResponse to the parameters that Bruce just described in the PowerShell itself. So we're going to look at some sample actions.xml and what this would look like for this script. We need to do some things like change the SmartResponse name and GUID, right? So there's actually a GUID that you use to uniquely identify each SmartResponse plugin. And if you've taken something like a sample Hello World actions.xml and you're modifying it, well, if you forget to modify the GUID and you start reusing that one XML file, you're going to start to run into a collision, and you're going to start overwriting the same plugin. So changing the name and GUID is pretty important. Changing action names and commands. So we need to do something different in here, and this is what you actually see in the web console or in the client console when you're configuring this or when you're executing it ad hoc. So this is pretty important. And then actually going through and defining the various parameters. So if we get this started, what we're looking at here is actually an example from your original, how many times are we going to print out hello world, right? So we would be passing in what we want to print out. So you can see we have a static input here. We're gonna print out hello world.
So there were
prints at once.
Yeah. So there are 2 actions in this Hello World plugin. There's the one that is just 1-line output. You give it a phrase and it prints it out once. You've got a second action that I have collapsed down here, which is the multi-line output. It has 2 parameters: whatever you're going to print out, that string, and how many times that you want to print it out. So this is included in the appendix for reference, but it ties it back to that Hello World PowerShell that we started with.
So to kind of briefly take this apart, you can sort of see how this XML is structured. So we're defining the XML schema that we actually need to build this in. This isn't something you really ever need to change. This is where we start getting into things that we need to change. So the name that you see here in this remediation plugin definition, this actually is the name of the plugin. And as we go across here, we've also got isLogarithm plugin equals false. So the isLogarithm plugin equals true flag is something that we use to generate content that we're going to deliver through community, that we're actually certifying. So when you're building these on your own, if you take one of ours apart to modify it, you probably want to set this to false. We've also got this GUID, the GUID that I was describing to uniquely identify this plugin from all other plugins. We also have a version string here. And it's really important to remember that this version string has to be integers. So if I come back to this, maybe I do want to add that set risk level later on. What I can do is just increment that version and make sure that the GUID stays the same. And then when I import the new version of the plugin, it'll replace any of the existing actions. Like I've actually replaced the script files that are being executed, but as long as I keep that stuff the same, then anywhere I've got this plugin already configured on an alarm, all those actions are just transparently replaced in configuration. The next thing we're going to do here is define an action, right? So the action name one-line output, this is that action that shows up when you're viewing it in the web console or when you're configuring this on an alarm. And then we have a command, PowerShell.exe. This is what's actually executed through the command line. And then what we're going to do is essentially start defining parameters. And the first parameter that we define is, well, what script are we going to execute? So you can see how these get put together as it's being executed. We're calling PowerShell.exe with a parameter of -file srp PowerShell.ps1. And then subsequent parameters are just being added onto that. So in this case, we really don't have a variable parameter. We're just passing in the string that we want to repeat. So going through and doing some of this actual modification, if you want to come up with a new GUID, there are functions in PowerShell to do it automatically. I usually have to Google them every time I want to generate a new GUID anyway. So it's probably easiest to just Google GUID generator, and you're going to get a website like this where you just say generate, and it's going to spit one out. And then all you have to do is copy this guy and replace that GUID. And then if you're coming back to it and modifying it, leave that GUID the same. All right, so the next thing we were saying is we need an action name. We need to call this get risk level, because that's actually what we're trying to do. We're still using PowerShell to execute this. The script that Bruce wrote is a PowerShell script. So we're going to fill it, or we're going to leave the command, in this case, PowerShell.exe. But now that we have a new script to call, we're going to change this to srp host.ps1. That was the name of the script file that was actually still visible. It'll go back to the script that was actually being written in here. All right, let me catch back up. You can actually stack these parameters. If you need to basically define one parameter that will pass multiple flags onto the script, you can do that. So you can see Bruce has basically hard-coded this action into a single parameter with the file. So if you're not planning on needing to change this down the road, that's essentially just saying, all right, this is always going to be change risk level until I come back and modify this configuration file. And then as we get into parameters, so once again, these are parameters that we're now passing into the PowerShell script. So the first one that we have is lrhost. We give it a friendly name and then the flag that the script is actually expecting.
So this friendly name is what you're actually going to see. If you run this through the web console, it says lrhost : and then you have a little input box that gets passed into this parameter. So that, and the same thing on an alarm, that's what tells the SmartResponse infrastructure what to call this thing when it's displaying the data field for your input.
Yeah. We have multiple types of parameters, and I really like these examples because we get to go through a couple of them that are pretty common. So the first thing that we're going to do is fill in an alarm field, is actually what we're doing here. So anytime that we configure this on an alarm, we're going to set a default value that is the alarm field known source host. And this will map to known host origin when you're actually looking at an alarm. All that's doing is setting a default. So if you need to fill in something by hand or if you're running this ad hoc, it's really easy to pick a different field or type something in. Second, we're going to pass in a second string parameter that is the API key itself. Right? So this is just going to pop up a text field inside of the alarm configuration and let you paste in a key. That's kind of the simplest type of parameter that we can have here.
Something else that we could have done here was made this an encrypted parameter. And if you look in, we have an example later on from the SmartResponse developer guide that tells you what an encrypted parameter would look like. And what this says is, first of all, if you're saving anything like an alarm configuration, it's going to encrypt that parameter in the database. And second of all, it's going to show up as all asterisks when you type in the password or the API key.
Yeah, so it's a nice way to secure credentials. If you want to be able to store those credentials for execution, but you don't necessarily want to just hand them to any analyst that's executing the plugin. The third type of parameter we have up here is another string parameter with default input, but in this case we're just filling in that URL, that base URL. And doing it this way means it's always going to be auto-populated, and you don't have to worry about pasting it in every time or anything like that. All right, there we go. And what we really want to highlight here is this is a one-to-one mapping of each of these parameters that we're defining in the XML. Those are things that we were defining in the script itself. So we're just taking a field from an alarm or that a user is going to have to enter, and we're passing that into the script. And that's why I say this is really just a mapping file of what we're seeing in the sim to what we need to pass to the script to eventually be executed. And one of the other common tipping points that we run into is adding a space at the end of these switches. So we have the capability to kind of combine parameters as they're passed in. You can just put one after the other, and it'll just concatenate these fields. So you can see on each of these switches, on each of these parameters, we're adding in a space so that there's space in between. Some languages handle spaces differently. So if we did things like automatically put in a space, and then you leave one of these blank, then you'd end up with multiple spaces. Different languages handle white space in different ways. All right. And the next thing we wanted to talk about is, well, you remember this known S host. Well, how would you know to use that, right? I wouldn't expect any of you to. I actually don't expect any of us to do it because the mapping is pretty obscure at this point. So we have documented what are all of those alarm field names. Where would I look those up to know to pass that particular string into SmartResponse? So the SmartResponse developer guide is really the place to go for this kind of stuff. It's got great examples. It's really an awesome tool for understanding how to build SmartResponse that hopefully just complements what we're doing here today. But it also has some of this reference material. So things like if you need to pass in the source IP address from a log message, now you know that is just SIP. Like that one's pretty straightforward. Some of these are not as straightforward. If you want to do things like origin host, well, we actually call that login behind the scenes. That's the database field that's storing it. There's really no way that you would know that. It happens to be the same mapping that Lucene filters use, but once again, still pretty obscure.
One more thing to call out here, if I give a default field like source IP, it's going to populate it by default for when you configure this on an alarm. If you're running it ad hoc from the web console, you actually won't get that. You'll have to click in there and it'll populate that list of fields from the log message in the drop-down to help you auto-complete, but it won't put that in there by default, and that's something that is on our enhancement list.
Yeah, the way to think of that is there's no alarm to pull that information from if you're running it ad hoc, so you have to populate it yourself by picking from the available log fields.
So we got about 1 minute left, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but it's a basic thing. When you're in the SmartResponse plugin manager in the client console, there is a button in there that is create, and that pops up a window that you select your folder. So inside that folder, you should have your actions.xml file and whatever scripts you need to run. Now I left my test file in here, which I probably shouldn't do because it actually has my API key in there. So if I'm compiling this for myself to test or internally, okay, fine. But if I'm sharing it out on the community, I'm going to want to remove that before I send it out there, because all this LPI is a gzip. You can change the extension on any LPI file and figure out what's going on in the background. So really all of our SmartResponse plugins are open source. When you validate that, it's going to make sure your XML is correct. If it gives you an error here, typically what I do is I put it into an online XML validator, which will help me figure out what's wrong pretty quickly. And we're working on some additional tooling that may help solve that from within the context of what you're using to compile. But for now, online XML validator is probably your best bet. What that spits out is this LPI file in a naming convention that makes very little sense. AR, or Auto Remediation Plugin, the old name for SmartResponse, with the plugin GUID that we generated earlier, and the date. Immediately I rename this to something like SRP host LPI, otherwise I forget what it is, and it's useless. I gotta go recompile my thing. You import it after the LPI is generated, just like you'd import any other SmartResponse file, and it's ready for you in the web console. You can use the plugin dropdown to select your SRP host and get risk level, provide it the input, and we get the SmartResponse output we've been looking for all along.
Yep. So I know we're out of time. Definitely wanted to thank everybody for being here. If you have questions, come find us either in between sessions or later this week.